It's great to be with you. My name is Jeff Fuller. You certainly can find everything Jay Fuller interviews on our YouTube channel, Facebook group, Instagram, and Twitter. And highlighting and telling stories is what I want to do because I think it's better to be the hero maker than the hero. And one, Abigail Smithson, is joining us, and she has a great podcast, Dear Adam Silver, that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But Abigail, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, first of all, I heard Alex Wolf, who is a Vermonter, Vermont Frost Heave, writer for the Sports Illustrated, longtime publication, on your podcast, Dear Adam Silver. First of all, where did you find Alex, and what intrigued you to bring him on your show?
Well, I had just been in Lithuania, in September of 2019, I was in Lithuania for about 5 weeks doing my own basketball-focused project on Senda Berenson, who is known to be the mother of women's basketball. And she was born in what was then Russia, is now Lithuania, back in 1865. So I was there researching her, and I returned to the United States and to Arizona. And a friend of mine, when I told him about being in Lithuania, he said that it reminded him of Big Game, Small World, this wonderful book written by Alex Wolf about, he basically traveled around the world for a year studying how basketball exists in different places. So I just sort of was so excited that I could read about someone else's experience, and then getting the chance to read about that and thinking how I could sort of use Alex's book moving forward for my own work as kind of like a blueprint, because he's already done many of the things that I hope to do, just in a different format. So after sitting on his book for, I read it, and then I thought about it for about 5 months, and then I reached out to him to see if he might want to be on the podcast, and he said yes, which was so exciting.
Yeah, he's a great guy, and he's so genuine. It just makes it remarkable to have somebody that has that much life experience, but sharing that time with you like you're doing for me. So thank you for that. Your website, abigailsmithson.com, it has all of these. I tried to pull up the screen. I couldn't do that, but it has all these references for basketball, the net trades, Dear Adam Silver, no look pass, marks made, and the artist statement, which I want to talk about that in a little bit as well. But did you grow up playing basketball? Why this intrigue, curiosity about this sport?
Yeah, I did not grow up playing. I mean, I think I grew up in a house that cared about basketball, and I played a little bit, but I'm not a very competitive person or someone who wants to compete directly against someone for something else. So I think that I always enjoyed, shooting hoops. I have a pretty good jump shot. I can play horse, for hours, whatever it is, but I've never really felt that good about, when someone tries to take the ball from me or keep me from doing something, I just completely shut down. So there were some pretty ugly, like, YMCA youth games in there for me as a child. So after realizing that, I still really loved watching it. And I think that sort of my infatuation with the NBA, this is around like 1995, starting when I was about 7 or 8 years old. This is before the WNBA. I also had sort of, like a celebrity crush on a lot of the players that I was watching. So, John Stockton, Gary Payton, Michael Jordan, like all these players, I was sort of infatuated with them. And I also wanted to kind of be them to some extent. So it was a very tricky relationship, but I felt really strongly about watching and showing up every night or whenever the games were on. And it felt like a very active experience for me to just watch. And I think as I've gotten older and I've still felt the desire to watch, I've also felt a responsibility to respond in some way and to be as active as I can as a fan.
And I think certainly during this time, it's a great time to do so. You mentioned playing horse. It was kind of our yard time we talk about being in the Northeast once this COVID-19 hit. It was still got chilly, but we forced ourselves to go outside to go play a game of horse or a few games, especially until I beat my son and daughter. Can you just talk about what you've been experiencing during this time of COVID? And then we'll talk about what's taking place in our culture as well. But when the COVID first hit, how did that strike you?
Well, it was a little, I think I had a particularly unique situation, like job-wise, because I didn't have a full-time job before this started. So I was coming off of another artist residency in Lawrence, Kansas, where I've been working on some basketball related stuff. And I was supposed to get married in mid-March. And it just seemed like all of a sudden, job searching and getting married was everything to be put on hold for a while. And I think that in some ways, mostly it feels like the pandemic has laid bare like every sort of social injustice that exists in our society that has been highlighted to such an extreme that we're seeing based on who is getting sick, how many people are dying in different communities based on race and income level. It's really, it's been so upsetting seeing how those extremes are really, really highlighted during this time. And so for me, like in a personal way, like I haven't had a huge shift in my day to day because I was already going to be around the house quite a bit. But knowing that we're seeing everything just totally unpacked as far as injustices go. And then I think that leads right into the discussion of what we're seeing now with protests and a lot of anger and frustration that I believe is rightfully being expressed in many ways because of what has led up to these events. I think that there's such a quickness to compare what's happening now to 2014 with Ferguson. But I was in Baton Rouge in 2016 when Alton Sterling was shot and killed, and that was days before Philander Castile was shot and killed in Minneapolis. So, and then since then, of course, Freddie Gray, and there's just been this is nothing new, and it feels slightly like there's discussions happening now that could lead to some significant change, which would be so welcome and needed.
That's definitely the hope. I know that COVID-19, I was a director of mentoring for a few years before, and I know there are several cases of depression just being quarantined, and just with the COVID-19, people are just so antsy. And we actually had a couple of family members, extended family that we know of, two, which is nuts, but part of a murder-suicide, and just this whole just craziness taking place. And looking at the silver lining, because everything was a powder keg, I think it is forcing us to have conversations about what truly is important. I've always said protest is great, riots are bad, but I think the noise has to be loud enough where people begin to recognize there's a problem, not just, oh, well, this happens every other year. From your opinion, your vantage point, those conversations needing to take place for true change to happen, how important is it that we do hear voices of influential white people, as has been said by some professional athletes? How important is it that we do have use the right to vote wherever you vote, but to say I voted? It was unfortunate for me to hear that Colin Kaepernick said that he didn't vote in the last election. And it's, of all people, at least say that we have or use this right. But where do you fall on this, this concern, this conversation?
Oh, it's so complex. And I think, as a white woman, it is difficult for me to sort of understand. I mean, I think I can understand, but it's hard because Colin Kaepernick is saying the system is broken and voting is a part of the system. I mean, as I understand, he's protesting what he believes to be systematic injustices and systematic racism, and that in 2016, at least, he did not see a big enough difference between what Hillary Clinton might do and what Donald Trump might do once in office in order to cast a vote for that. And I can't be the one necessarily to say, I mean, I want everyone to vote. I think the more people that vote, the majority rule will win out. But if you believe the system to be stacked against you, just as a whole, voting doesn't seem like it's enough. And I think, I mean, it's upsetting, of course, to see there be sort of violence throughout the protests. But at the same time, I mean, I think we need to listen to a certain extent. I think it's tricky because of sometimes we're seeing there's within the protests, when there is rioting and there is violence and there is damage done to neighborhoods, things like that, that sometimes it's not done by the people who are out there protesting. It can be done by outsiders who are looking for to cause more trouble. So it's so difficult to say exactly where to fall on that. But just, I think that in general, like this anger and this frustration and this that it doesn't change, that feeling being expressed sometimes in violent forms has to be listened to and not dismissed as only violent and only irrational, but something that like we need to hear as some kind of response. Sometimes I would say like a slightly valid response to seeing someone crushed to death in the middle of the street in the afternoon, like, you know, by you know, there's one police officer doing it, but there's 3 other police officers around that are offering some kind of support in that. So it's a difficult situation, and I hope that Colin Kaepernick feels that voting will make a difference this time after these past 4 years. But when the system is stacked against you, and I'm not coming from a position of feeling that way, it's hard to say what's the right thing to do. But there's you know, and I think now we're having this other discussion about Colin Kaepernick really that what he did, and this should have happened in 2016 and 2017, but that what he was doing was so heroic. And I think that it's long overdue to have that in a more mainstream format, to have that discussion.
Definitely. He was bringing attention in a peaceful way. And I heard some sportscaster mention the other day that he was not protesting the flag, but he was sharing his protest during the recognition of the flag. And I think that's important to differentiate. Abigail Smithson, making some time. Let's back up a little bit. Where did you grow up? And talk about how you grew up. Were those values planted in you by parents, by mentors? Where did you get that value system that you have fleshed out now?
Sure. I grew up in Redwood City, California, which is about 20 minutes south of San Francisco. So just in the Bay Area there. And let's see. I mean, it's tricky because my parents have always really encouraged my sister and I to speak out and to support causes that sort of push back against issues of injustice. And I went, when we started the Iraq War, I was about, let's see, I think I was 13 or 14 years old. And, I went to several protests with my father. And I think that since then, having seen my parents march and protest for several different reasons, especially since 2016, and that just seems like I've just felt a lot of support around sort of speaking out or sharing my opinions, at least if it's with my circle or hopefully beyond that. And that's one of the reasons I made the podcast, was to try and provide a platform and to also share some of the ideas that I had. And I think that growing up in the Bay Area, it's a very liberal bubble. It's a blue sort of bastion, and that's all well and good, but recognizing that even within those spaces, there are issues of how we deal with diversity and how we recognize people that have different backgrounds and different color skin. And it's just, I think that when I went to college and then having spent time for graduate school in Baton Rouge, and I think that just realizing that no place is perfect, and wanting to address racism does not have to be something that is explicit in any way for it to be a very powerful form of oppression, and wanting to really recognize how it exists in subtle ways on a day-to-day basis that are not explicit. And I think that, I love where I grew up, and it's such an amazing place, and I have dreams of going back there if it wasn't so expensive. But it is also, there's issues there, and just what I just mentioned about it being so expensive, that's also super problematic for the people that are from there and have grown up there, that can't afford to live there anymore if they don't work for Google, when people are moving there from all over the country to work for Google. So it's there's a lot of ways in which issues of white supremacy and systemic racism manifest themselves, and stepping away from where I was from and kind of seeing different places where it exists, and even, in Lithuania, or where racism is not such a pronounced issue because it's a much wider place. They don't have as many people with as many different skin colors, but still how it functions in different places. I think that and of course through sports, it's inevitable that if you want to talk about sports in any critical way, you have to talk about race, and that's from golf to basketball to just everything in between.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. And it's interesting, or just a quick funny story. I was asked about engaging in the conversation of being a minority in Vermont. And I said, well, I can talk from the aspect of being a Vermont redneck, but not being a Korean, because I was adopted as an infant, and this is all I've ever known. However, there certainly are other aspects to that. I think it was Doug Gottlieb who mentioned how just sports, it does bring the world together, because it does locate or identify the common ground of trying to win a game together. So at least when the clock begins to the clock ends, you're working towards that common goal. And now if our culture could realize to take that beyond a time limited space, I think that's the important issue. I want to talk about your podcast a little bit more, and then go to your art and just your schooling. Your story, again, I found it very interesting, and just wanted to bring you on to share a little bit about that. You shared a podcast or so ago, a couple ago, about The Last Dance and what that meant to you. And I just thought it was very interesting. I thought the same thing about Scott Pippen, drafted by the Seattle Supersonics. You could almost do a 10-hour documentary on him, his background, his sibling that was in the wheelchair, his father that had the severe health issues. Again, for those that didn't listen to your podcast, what still stands out after that Last Dance completed a few weeks ago in your mind that really prompts curiosity in you on what took place of those different characters, different players?
Sure. And I actually had another episode of the Last Dance recorded and ready to share on my platform. But then, with everything that's going on, I felt like it was not the right time, as far as, because that podcast didn't include anything else. So I'm thankful for the chance to get to talk about it on here. And that last discussion was just so much about, like, what do we think of this as kind of a piece of art? What is this offering us as sort of a cultural document? And I think there's been pushback from documentarians like Ken Burns on, this can't be a documentary because Michael Jordan, is a collaborator on this. And so how can it be in that category? And I actually don't even care if it's in that category or not, because I still think it's such an important sort of, I can't say document, but it's just an important kind of thing that we get to have this new information to sort of dissect and think about both the past and I think the present. I'm trying to think about those last few episodes that I hadn't discussed on the podcast before, but I just think that it was just an important, of course, everything has felt heightened in its sense of importance right now because of the pandemic and watching the Last Dance when you knew that so many other people were watching. I'm trying to think about what I talked about on the podcast, but it just felt like I was worried when it started, based on what I'd read, that I was going to end up my feelings towards Michael Jordan might change, because in some ways he's the way that he exists in my head when I was 8 years old, in some ways that is still how he exists. And of course I think about the Republicans buy sneakers too. And I think about, I wish he had done this, or I wish he had done that with his money or whatever. But, now we're seeing he's just signed up alongside the Jordan brand. He's giving $100 million to fight issues of systematic racism. And again, I think it comes back to also me being a white fan and what expectations do I place on a player. Michael Jordan grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina, that had a terrible, this is resurfacing now because of our discussion about sort of what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma with the sort of massacre of the Black community there. But that also happened in Wilmington, North Carolina, just right after Reconstruction. So when Black people had actually like gained a lot of support and power there, that was through a massacre sort of taken away, and a lot of people lost their lives. And I've been to Wilmington, North Carolina. I've driven from Michael Jordan's house to his high school. Like, I followed his daily commute. I've seen the Confederate statues there. Like, that dichotomy is very important to recognize, that where he came from and what he lived through is very different from what I did. So I wish the Republicans buy sneakers too didn't happen, but at the same time, it's like that was the 1990s were a different time. Right. Branding then was not looked at with the same critical eye that it is now, as far as what Nike and McDonald's and Hanes and all the brands that Michael Jordan was associated with. That I think that there wasn't that same level of scrutiny over who's making money off of this person's body, which I think is like an ongoing question within sports. So I still think that, so at the end of the documentary, I thought there were so many powerful moments, and just watching Michael Jordan kind of work through this idea of who his teammates might think of him. And that footage of him, and this has been discussed so much, but that footage of him crying on the floor after winning that was the 4th title against the Supersonics, which took place on Father's Day. And I think that there is so much discussion about just wanting, we want more from the people that, we admire or exalt in some way. And Michael Jordan is one of those people, but, being reminded of all that he went through with the media, and, being asked if his gambling had something to do with his father's death, or even just all that footage of him walking out of the locker room and being surrounded by cameras. I mean, as a photographer, I think a lot about sort of the predatory act of shooting or taking or capturing someone through a camera. And I felt that, there was just some violence to those images, a lot of how he was surrounded and not given any space. And you could even see that he often was just backing up and being like, whoa, Right. And those really intimate moments with his security guard, Gus, just like those special things that was not being told in the 1990s. And I just thought that was really great.
I definitely enjoyed it. And I think with Jordan, he's still a superhero. I mean, you got to see enough behind the scenes to what he allowed you to see, but enough behind the scenes to see that he wasn't perfect. He did balk at all the cameras of trying to be or maintain that image. But and I think it is, for me personally, making that comment, having it recorded, documented, that Republicans buy sneakers too. We can learn a lot from that, and we might be opposed. But even with the Confederate statues, sometimes I think it's good that they remain so we can see where we've come from, and that we would never return to that place in history or to that mindset. But with The Last Dance, a poignant story that came to me was finding out that Steve Kerr's dad was murdered as well, and just having that in common with Michael Jordan. I just thought the different teammates that Jordan had, even though it's called The Last Dance, but everybody knew it was a Jordan documentary, it brought out so much of the different teammates, and that was very special. Now I think they need to do a sequel of the sidekicks. I think that would be a lot of fun to watch as well.
Yes, definitely. And I loved this was like in an earlier episode, but when John Paxson hits the 3-pointer, like, this is 1992. I was like 4 years old. I was not watching, but like when he's interviewed about that, and he just says, that was so special for me, and it's just that I think goes to sort of speak to how, that what Michael Jordan said about wanting his teammates to feel what he felt when he won. He wanted them to feel it too. And seeing how, what Steve Kerr got to experience by saying, like, hey, if they come after you, like, pass the ball to me, and then him hitting that shot, like, that was a lovely moment. One of the first Valentines my boyfriend ever made me when we started dating was the Michael Jordan and Steve Kerr. After that moment, they kind of tap, like, fist bump a little bit, and it is this really beautiful moment. And I also can really understand what you're saying about the Confederate statues. To a sense, I think that they could have a place they could exist physically somewhere else that's not in the middle of a town or one of the first things you see when you
Right.
drive through. In Wilmington, it's at the center point of the town. It's sort of, you can't miss it. Everyone has to drive around it in this roundabout. So I think that I'm fine with them being thrown overboard like the other day they did in Bristol, England, I think, as well, just because there is so much emotion right now. But I think that putting them in some kind of context where we can learn about them without them being at the sort of such symbols of a place.
Yeah. Instead of being celebrated, to look at the true context of how we view them now and what we've learned from them.
Yes.
Abigail Smithson, making some time. I would love to talk basketball more and more. The Dear Adam Silver podcast is excellent, and I listen to a ton of podcasts. So thank you for bringing that to the top 10 of my listening enjoyment.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
Well, certainly. And you do more with your artistry, with your photography. Could you just share a little bit of that? And where did that love of art come from?
Oh, I mean, I think that I really like making things and sort of turning one thing into something else. And that can be physical. It can be, a blank piece of paper that you end up filling with color or lines or whatever it is. And it can also be like an idea. Like, I think that the podcast is very much rooted in my art practice now, that I'm turning sort of this idea of reaching out to Adam Silver into kind of a not a tangible thing, but a way to sort of communicate ideas. So I think I've always just really loved making and producing and coming up with lists and sort of tackling things through non-traditional ways. So of course, like, the best way for me to get in touch with Adam Silver is to write him an email, probably. And that's been like, his email has been offered to me by some people who have come on the podcast. But I also just think that, like, I don't know if that's the best. I don't know if that is staying true to what I want to do. I want to reach him through this like non-traditional path, because I think that has more power in it than sending the email. Potentially, I mean, who knows what I'm going to be saying in like 5 years when he still hasn't come on the show. But at this moment, like, I think it's really important to try to reach like the highest ranking administrator in basketball from someone who, as an artist, really doesn't have much say over anything that happens just in general, and wanting to sort of empower myself by addressing him directly. So I think that the sort of format of Dear Adam Silver, like, it could be Dear Donald Trump. I mean, I'm never going to have a podcast called that, because the other thing is that I respect Adam Silver. Sorry about that. But it could be insert the person that you want to address and have some change come from that here. And I've tried to get other projects going in that sense of wanting to use this as a way to, there's a whole, now Adam Silver has this podcast dedicated to him in a sense, like, he should respond in some way, I think, eventually. So I think that art, it's a really tricky time to be an artist right now, because some of the things that we do can feel a little unnecessary, but to a certain extent, like, thinking outside of how we interact with each other, or how we take care of each other and listen or anything like that. Like, it's just important to think in different ways. And, I've sent Adam Silver, I wrote him a bunch of letters, and I've made them into big cyanotypes, which are like sun prints. They're photographs that are made outside using sunlight. It's an old process from the mid 19th century. And I just was like, I want Adam Silver to get an envelope full of art, and just see what he does with it. And maybe it's in, my hope is that if it ended up being thrown out, that it was in the recycling, not the trash. But just this idea of that art can open up a few other ways of thinking than our normal day-to-day interactions allow for. And especially, I've become a little bit frustrated with like the gallery as a place to hold that art. And so wanting to expand beyond that particular physical location and think about where else art belongs.
That's so good. I actually really enjoy that concept as well. And I think that's the beauty of technology, whether it's social media or podcasts or YouTube, just getting things outside of the gallery which we all can learn from. But Abigail, thank you so much for making the time. Wish you all the best. Look forward to listening to more of Dear Adam Silver, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon down the road.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeff. I so appreciate it, and the platform is great. And I just want to also recognize something that you mentioned earlier on about this family that you'd spoken to, that there had been a murder suicide since the pandemic started. And I just want to say that I have experienced some comfort during this time, like of the pandemic, just as far as having, a house that I feel comfortable in, and someone to spend some time with. And I just want to acknowledge how that is such a varying experience across the board, and that this is not easy for anyone, and is much harder for some people, and just really that is an important thing to remember.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And
yes,
again,
thank you.
My name is Jeff Fuller. That was Abigail Smithson joining. You can find her on Instagram and Twitter. I certainly encourage you to go find Dear Adam Silver, that podcast. Jay Fuller Interviews is where you can find me on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Instagram. We'll talk to you all again soon. Thanks again.